I sat down with Stephen Smith with Deloitte Access Economics and first asked if the budget now tips Australia towards a recession. Stephen Smith, good to catch up with you here in Canberra. I just want to ask about this budget and whether, in your opinion, the worst case scenario that's painted by this budget actually puts Australia closer to a recession than we were before.
Look, this was a no surprises budget. We didn't learn a lot last night about the government's priorities or their policies. This was instead an opportunity for the government to update the budget's parameters for some economic realities. And the situation in terms of the government's fiscal position is probably worse than we expected. That's true. There are some important global economic challenges. I'm not sure that Australia is closer to a recession, though. But certainly it's an uncertain time.
Okay, so then you come to this budget and what it means for business in particular. The very high energy prices, people are talking about households and the impact on that, plus inflation, and also the prospect of higher interest rates out for longer as a result. But for business, trying to confront those higher costs, it could be the reality as to whether they are competitive or whether they're not competitive.
Yeah, there were really two big challenges that were outlaid in this budget. One was the NDIS, which I'm sure we'll get to. The other was gas prices. It's very clear with the assumptions laid out in this budget just how significant increases in energy prices will be. That will hurt business badly over the next couple of years, not just right now, but over sort of 23, 24 as well. And so combine that with shortage of labour, other cost increases, it is a challenging time for business.
But Stephen, business is facing right now higher energy prices, higher interest rates, potentially higher wages and falling demand. So it's not going to be necessarily a good environment for business over the next few years.
Look, it will be challenging. There are some positives in the budget for business as well, including more migrants, so an easing of the visa backlog that we've seen. Some longer-term investments in university and TAFE places. That's all a positive thing, and that'll be good for skills and good for business. But absolutely, it's a challenging time on the cost side for business.
But even those TAFE places, to train a carpenter or a plumber or an engineer, whatever it might be, is going to take 3 to 4 years. So there's a lag in the time it takes to actually take the pressure off the workforce.
That's right. And so this year and next year, definitely challenging times for business, costs rising, and honestly, not a lot that business can do about that to avoid some of these key input costs, labour, energy. Those are important costs for business that are difficult to avoid.
So there's a presumption here that inflation comes down back to the Reserve Bank's preferred band of 2 to 3%, that interest rates eventually moderate. But there's another argument that inflation remains, that interest rates remain high, that the pressure remains on the economy.
That's a possible scenario, certainly. Our view, and also the view that was set out in the budget by the government last night, is one of a pretty quickly moderating economic environment, so particularly consumer spending coming down quite quickly over the next 12 months. Part of that is the higher inflation, the higher interest rates, but economic growth overall halving in 23-24 relative to this year. So that's the sort of environment where we do think that inflation will moderate, but not this week, not next week. It's still a little while away.
But Stephen, sort of surely as you start to see the household savings ratio fall, as households use up their savings buffer because of these higher costs, that's the point at which their own demand is going to be curtailed. That's the problem for business.
That will be a challenge. So consumer spending, 6% growth this year, down to 1.2% growth next year. It's a big cut. One of the really interesting things coming out of COVID has been the resilience of consumers. That war chest that you talk about, the high savings rate, that's now almost been worked through, and so there's not a lot there to continue to support our spending, and not a lot in this budget for cost of living pressures to support households, and so that absolutely does have a flow-on effect for business.
Because the government's a bit constrained itself. It can't spend because that will create inflation and keep interest rates higher. And yet, at the moment, you've actually got spending which is significantly higher than the future revenues. So at some point, something's got to give.
That's right. I mean, one of the key tests of this budget was that it didn't add to inflation and interest rate pressures, and it absolutely passed that test. But what it also revealed is, over the medium to long term, this budget has a big structural deficit problem, about 2% of GDP. That's about $50 billion a year. Big spending challenges coming, and this gap between spending and revenue for the government is going to have to close.
Okay, because one point is that the the government can't grow its way out of this. There's not the economic growth coming down the track that you can see that will get them out of the problems. So as a result, it's going to be a situation where spending at some point has got to be curtailed. And you think about things that they've got to spend on, like the NDIS.
That's right, and that's a medium to long-term challenge. We do think in the short term there'll be a little bit more revenue for the government than what was in the budget last night. There were some very conservative assumptions around commodity prices. Thermal coal prices, for example, assumed to fall by 86% over the next 6 months. That looks very, very conservative to us. But that is still going to be temporary, whether it's 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. That commodity revenue is temporary. The issue is in the medium to long term. That the budget last night showed a structural deficit problem for 10 years and more. That's NDIS, that's defence. These very large and quickly growing spending programs that are difficult by definition to pull back. You're going to pitch Australia's disabled against Australia's taxpayers. That is a nightmare scenario for any government.
For any government, there is no doubt. Stephen Smith, good to catch up with you in Canberra. Many thanks for your time.
Thanks, Ross.